ice, distance, and darkness. That's what defines Greenland as a military problem. If you ask whether the rest of NATO could realistically defend Greenland against a US invasion, you're really asking who can move, fight, and sustain under Arctic conditions, through blizzards, on ice-choked seas, with almost no infrastructure to lean on. And you're asking who would even want to. Outside of the MAGA core, I don't think the US public would back an invasion of Greenland, or Canada for that matter, and I don't think Washington would choose to rupture NATO over it. But for the sake of the community's most voted topic for our October community request, let's pressure test the scenario and see what winter capability, geography, and logistics actually say. I'm Tuomas, a former officer in the Finnish Defense Forces, and this is part 1 of October's community-voted video. As the question was about Canada and Greenland, we'll focus on Greenland this week and do a Canada-specific video next week. Let us, as any good war planner would, start with the map. Greenland is officially huge. Its coastline is carved by fjords, a vast glacier sits in the middle all year round, and the population could fit into a mid-sized European football stadium. There are only a handful of airfields that matter, a few usable deep-water ports, and long, unforgiving distances between them. The weather isn't just cold, it is equipment-breaking cold, and generally there's a mean wind which quickly packs snow into your gear at least 9 months of the year, from the end of September to the end of May. Operationally, this means that an army not trained or equipped for cold weather fighting would struggle after just a few months in theater. The biggest issue for a weapons-heavy military like the US is that rubber hardens, batteries die, lubricants thicken, optics fog, and wind turns a routine lift into a horror show. A bit like during the Finnish winter, you don't choose your tempo in Greenland. The weather chooses it for you. Any attacker depends on a tiny number of runways and protected anchorages, and any defender, including the Danish special operators who use Greenland as their playground, knows exactly which ones those are. Most American military gear would cease to work if it was deployed to Greenland, including the normal US service rifle and much of its most advanced military technology, like the Abrams, Stryker, Bradley, and entire tubed artillery fleet, but we'll go over concrete examples of that a bit later in this episode. Now flip to the politics and likelihood of the US actually going for an allied territory and wrecking its alliances beyond repair. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark and inside NATO. A US assault would mean attacking a treaty ally, an Article 5 nightmare, a diplomatic shockwave, and a strategic own goal that shatters American alliances worldwide. As we covered in our episode recently on the actual strength of the US allies, it is quite clearly the second military power on the globe. That is why I call this scenario unlikely. But unlikely doesn't mean uninteresting, because it exposes the physics that decide Arctic campaigns and winter warfare, a topic I've trained soldiers in for decades now: logistics, weather discipline, and winter skills. Those factors don't care how big your defense budget is. Try asking Stalin how that worked in my own Finland in 1939. Winter capability is where Europe, especially the Nordics, Baltics, and British, quietly shines. Norway, Sweden, Finland, and to a lesser extent Denmark, train to fight in snow, darkness, and deep cold several months every year. They practice ski-borne infantry movement, over-snow mobility with BV series carriers and snowmobiles, Arctic casualty care, camouflage in whiteout conditions, and the kind of small unit fieldcraft that keeps people alive at -30. The UK, Netherlands, Germany, France, and others also send units north for winter warfare rotations every year, building a shared playbook: short, sharp movements between hardened bivouacs, fuel and battery management, cold weather marksmanship, and keeping drones and optics working when most electronics want to die. This culture of winter soldiering matters more than shiny kit. It shows up in the boring routines: how you dry socks, how you pack a bulk sled, how you rotate sentries so no one freezes, and in particular how to tire out and isolate your enemy by using the elements. First, let's look at what kind of Arctic capability the opposing sides would have in such a scenario. In a scenario where the rest of NATO had to defend Greenland, or even consider operations in extreme Arctic conditions, the balance of true winter capability between Europe, Canada, and the United States would matter more than almost anything else. And here, Europe and Canada have a clear edge. Across the Nordic region, winter warfare isn't an afterthought. It's the foundation of military training. Between national Arctic brigades, reserve formations, and large-scale NATO exercises like Cold Response and Nordic Response, Europe can field 80 to 120,000 active duty troops with recent, full-spectrum Arctic and subarctic training. Finland alone contributes a huge portion of that total, around 24,000 active troops and a wartime reserve exceeding 250,000, almost all trained to operate, move, and fight in snow and temperatures down to -30 or 40. Sweden and Norway add several tens of thousands more through elite Arctic units, Sweden's K4 battalion in Norland and Norway's Arctic Brigade, as well as annual cold weather rotations that push much of their professional armies through sub-zero field conditions. The United Kingdom, Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Italy, and France all run specialized winter and alpine elements that cycle through the same demanding Nordic courses each year. And that's before we mention how Norway's special operators host allied special teams for Arctic war games every year, where stories of them handing tough lessons to visiting elite US units are, let's just say, not uncommon. Canada adds another strong component. The Canadian Rangers, a lightly equipped but locally rooted force of over 5,600 personnel, act as the permanent eyes and ears of the Canadian military in the far north. They're backed by 4 Arctic Response Company groups, each around 150 troops, which train specifically for operations in frozen environments. When you factor in regular rotations like Operation Nunalivut and Arctic Bison, Canada can deploy somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 Arctic-trained personnel on relatively short notice, and scale that further through rotations of regular infantry trained in winter warfare. By contrast, the United States has made some strides in rebuilding its Arctic readiness in recent years, but it's still catching up. Its main Arctic formation is the 11th Airborne Division based in Alaska, numbering roughly 10 to 12,000 soldiers, supported by the Northern Warfare Training Center near Fairbanks. When you add the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport, California, and special operations courses in cold environments like Kodiak, Alaska, the total rises to about 15 to 25,000 U.S. troops with active Arctic or deep winter qualifications. That's still significantly fewer than Europe and Canada combined, though the U.S. has the logistics muscle and airlift to move faster once it's on the ground. Where European and Canadian forces really pull ahead is in kit that actually works in Greenland-grade cold. Across NATO minus the U.S., there are about 2,000 articulated over-snow carriers, mainly Swedish-made varying BV models that float over deep snow and keep running at -40, in service or serviceable storage. The U.S., by contrast, fields under 300, including its new BVS-10 buy, which hasn't yet arrived. It's the same story with light mobility. Europe and Canada together run roughly 10 to 14,000 military heavy snow scooters across the Nordics, France, Italy, Germany, Canada, and the Baltics, while U.S. forces operate a few hundred for Alaska, mountain warfare, and special operations rotations. In terrain where trucks or even light armored vehicles bog down, those numbers translate directly into an issue that is hard to overlook for any war planner. The same logic applies to armor and artillery, only fleets that actually run in deep cold count. Think CV-90, Norway and Finland's Leopard 2, Patria carriers, Sweden's Stridsvagn, Canada's LAV-6. All of them run with real winter modifications, external engine heaters, low-temperature lubricants, wider shoes and tracks, and Arctic maintenance kits. Norway and Sweden even field CV-90 variants tuned specifically for snow. Add those winter variants up and you get the picture. Across NATO without the United States, there are 300 to 500 cold-weather modified modern tanks, about 600 to 1,000 winterized infantry fighting vehicles, and well over 1,000 Patria variants made in Poland and Finland that can operate in extreme cold. By contrast, the U.S. Army has no armored brigades permanently based in the Arctic. Abrams, Strykers, and Bradleys can be winter-kitted with a lot of work, but the number of fully cold-weather packaged armor sets ready for sustained Arctic ops is tiny compared to Europe's capability in this area. We're talking a few hundred in total, and the knowledge base within the US military to perform this sort of retrofitting is likely just as small, after 70 years of mainly fighting in warmer climates. At least for now, if winter warfare broke out in the North Atlantic or Arctic, say in Greenland or the Norwegian Sea, the majority of troops who could move, fight, and survive there on short notice would still come from Europe and Canada. They've lived, trained, and fought in the cold for decades, and the equipment they use, from snowmobiles to over-snow carriers, is battle-tested and outsizes the US capability in the same department at least tenfold. So while the US would bring unmatched naval firepower and fair-weather air dominance to any defenders of Greenland, it's the Europeans and Canadians who would likely do most of the actual fighting on the ground in Arctic conditions. And that makes sense. This is their environment. They've trained for it, built vehicles for it, and can survive in it without needing massive energy inputs or specialized infrastructure. In simple terms, the US can likely cover the whole island in bombs, but the Northern Europeans and Canadians can stay there. Add to this the immense issues the US is currently facing in its sea lift capabilities in comparison to Europe's quite massive civilian freight and sea lift fleet, and you'd be hard-placed to see the US winning a protracted logistical war. So how would a fight look if someone forced this scenario? An American operation would likely depend on securing a small number of locations quickly, airfields and nearby harbors, then rushing in engineers, fuel, de-icing, shelters, and air defenses to keep the bridgeheads alive. That initial lift is vulnerable to timing. A 2-day storm window can close the sky, scatter ships, and leave air assault elements thin and isolated. It could likely use Pituffik Air Base as a forward operating base, but it is important to note that getting to and from this airbase over land is only possible with normal transport about 3 months of the year, and going from it to the more populated areas down south, over land, is a nigh-on impossible task without the proper gear. A European-Canadian defense would exploit that. You don't try to meet the US in a fair-weather set piece where its air force and carrier groups would decimate a defense. You make every landing zone a maintenance problem and every approach costly. You create white noise with decoys, radar reflectors, and heat sources in the wrong areas. You lay mines and sensor grids on the few viable taxiways. You combine long-range fires with small Arctic patrols, like that of the Danish Special Ops Team permanently on the island aptly named the Sirius Patrol, that can move on skis, behind dog sleds and snowmobiles, living off caches and hitting fuel depots and power units rather than chasing US units in the open. Denmark's recent cooperation with Ukraine likely means that it has access to non-electrical powered drones capable of knocking out the 4 diesel generators, keeping Pituffik warm. Without the necessary heating, the issues US troops had with the weather in Vietnam would seem like a dream when the temperatures drop below freezing in August. Maritime operations are no easier. Ice and distance punish large surface groups. Submarines and long-range patrol aircraft still matter, but the fight narrows to a few usable approaches and anchorages. A defender does not need to sink everything. It only needs to make replenishment uncertain, slow, and costly. That forces an attacker to bring ice-capable escorts, more tankers, more de-icing agents, more of everything. As we say in the Finnish army, winter logistics scale badly. A drum of fuel in winter is heavier in effort than it is in kilograms. It needs heated storage, careful handling, and a clean supply chain of winter-capable pumps, hoses, and couplings that will not crack in minus 40 degrees Celsius. Many recruits in the Nordic armies learn this the hard way. One slip in preparation can ruin an operation. In Europe plus Canada, the ice-capable inventory is again much larger than the American inventory. Norway fields 4 Arctic-capable patrol vessels, 1 Svalbard-class ice-breaking, and 3 Jan Mayen-class ice-strengthened patrol ships. Finland now brings 7 ice-capable ships, including NATO's foremost icebreaker production knowledge. Sweden brings 5, Canada brings 9, and is expanding further. The United Kingdom contribution is niche, but useful with HMS Protector. The Baltic states add capacity at the margins, Latvia has one. Estonia has one. The Netherlands adds one as well. Most of Greenland's ports freeze over in around November, and to be able to get anywhere close to land, you're very dependent on this ability. The US, for its part, only has 2 capable icebreakers, though they have recently signed a deal with Finland to create more, which would obviously be scrapped in such a scenario. So could the rest of NATO actually stop the US in Greenland? The blunt answer is that stopping isn't the right lens. The US is a superpower with unrivaled global lift and strike capabilities. If Washington chose to batter its way into Greenland, it could seize air and sea bridgeheads and pour in force. The realistic question is whether the rest of NATO could make that choice politically impossible and operationally miserable, so costly, slow, and publicly self-defeating that the idea collapses under its own weight as opposition to US casualties generally makes them pull out of wars. The answer there is yes. In the Arctic, a capable defender with winter skills doesn't need parity in tonnage, missiles, or fancy aircraft carriers. It needs to deny tempo, complicate sustainment, and wait for the attacker's maintenance and morale curves to dip below the red line after the brief 3 months of degrees above freezing are over. There's also the alliance dimension. NATO's strength isn't any single army, it's the habit of acting together. An American assault on Danish territory would snap that habit. European publics would rally to Denmark. Canada would be in an impossible position politically and strategically, and that tension alone shows why the scenario is so unlikely. Deterrence here is partly moral and legal, but it's also practical. Every US planner understands that fighting the weather and your own alliance at the same time is a losing proposition. As promised, next week we'll move to the people who currently lives above the noisy neighbors and ask the same hard question about Canada, where the distances aren't quite as large and the weather generally at least slightly favors the US arsenal. We'll look at Canada's strengths and weaknesses and look at how costly the same exercise would be if the US tried a similar move there. As always, have a great weekend, and if you haven't already, we'd be honored if you hit that subscribe and like button.